Hi, I'm Luke Sherveld. Welcome to another episode of Meet the Gaffer. Okay, this is part 3 of 4 about Kino Flo, and this is with Frieder Hochheim talking about color and color gamut. And now I'll link to another video below, and that's from the DCS Cinema Lighting Expo, which just happened middle of February 2019. And there he gives a sort of a condensed version of a longer talk with a slide deck. So you'll see images that kind of back up what he's talking about. Here is just going to be talking, but it's just sort of the general concept that comes back to a fair amount is this idea of how you make white light. So let's say you've got RGB, and when you put it on a scale, it gets kind of a curve like that. And then you've got white in the middle. And to make a fixture that has warm and cool light, you sort of have this Planckian curve from, warm to cool. And the kind of basic concept is that when you build an LED light for our work, for film production, video production, then you're getting, you sort of create a white that's a daylight white and a warm white. And then if you're going to have a light that can change between those two, then normally, if you don't have any RGB involved, it would just be a straight line. And if you have a straight line, then at some point it's probably going to be more magenta, because this would be magenta and this would be towards green if you just do a straight line. So if you have RGB emitters in your fixture, now you can play with that curve and stay closer to the Planckian curve. And then you get rid of this, and as you change from your warm to cool, you add a little green to pull out your magenta, and therefore keep a smoother curve between your warm and cool. So that's kind of the general concept that you'll be hearing about.
We started off as a fluorescent company. Now we've become a solid state lighting software company. When the LEDs first came on the market, it was kind of, when you think about it, it really is absurd. The whole notion of taking a bunch of little tiny spots and turning that into a light source is sort of counterintuitive, where if you can have a single lamp that's kind of big and large and projects light. So the initial LEDs were also of such quality that they really weren't well suited to the motion picture industry. The spectrum was not sufficient to support a high quality color reproduction, and the notion that a bunch of little dots would make up a light source just didn't really make a lot of sense, and it was expensive. But what it did offer, though, so there's some major advantages to the LED. Now that the color quality has been vastly elevated, the fact that you can now start combining multiple elements to blend color sources to create a broader spectrum, these are all really interesting advantages. So you're basically talking about a bunch of little pixels that you can now bring together, harmonize them in such a way that they are optimized for the camera performance. That you couldn't necessarily do with a single source or a single element light source, such as a fluorescent tube. There, all the work went up front into the phosphor, so we developed the phosphor to be correct, but you couldn't really vary it that much other than taking a cool, a daylight source and a tungsten source, a fluorescent, and basically just mixing them together through a dimmer or through switching. So with the LED, now the big challenge is, great, we have these light sources. Now how do we combine them in such a way that they actually enhance the lighting products that are already out there? We need to supersede what is already out there. And it's quite possible to do that now very, very handsomely with an LED light source. Once you start working with the software and start blending these colors, now you can optimize it for the camera. Now you can introduce special effects. All these different options now start to open up. And that in and of itself is very exciting. So when we first approached the whole concept of an LED, of course the first notion is let's at least get two good white sources. We need a tungsten source and we need a daylight source. And what could be easier than just mixing the two? So we were able to partner with two companies that were able to actually take our experience of what we've had in developing phosphors for fluorescent lamps and now start applying that to the LED. So we started off with two sources, a tungsten or a warm balanced source and a daylight source. And combining those two, we were able to come up with a broad range of Kelvin. With that are its own set of challenges. So if you're in the 3200 range and you've got great color, that's fine. As you transition to the other, as you blend these two sources to get to the 6500 Kelvin, you come across a midsection where we notice that, oops, it's actually starting to look a little magenta. And there's a clear explanation for it once you understand how light or how Kelvin travels the Planckian curve. When you're simply mixing two sources, you get to the middle, it's a direct linear line and it falls below the Planckian. Below the Planckian, you're magenta, above the Planckian, you're green. So since most cameras were, you mostly shoot in one or the other, you rarely shoot in the middle, it really wasn't that in your face. But if somebody were to shoot at 4,000, you might notice that there was a little bit of magenta involved. Now for us too, it was important to actually understand what in fact is the target. So here we are, we understood film. Kodak and Fuji, they would give us their spectral response curves. We knew what the target was. With electronic cinema camera, nobody wants to talk to you about their spectral response curves. The market is so competitive. Nobody's willing to share that data. So I got back together with the same gentleman who helped me with the early fluorescent lamps, and I said, you know, Mitch, you developed this spectrometer. How can we now get that understanding of the camera? So it was a substantial program, and we went and started modeling the cinema cameras. And we were able to now actually see the spectral response curves, and we saw that they were different. So much like film stocks were different, that's why there are reasons that some cinematographers would choose to shoot one film stock over another. They would choose Kodak over Fuji or Fuji over Kodak because they all had their own distinct nuances. And for a certain type of film, you may choose one stock over the other. Now we're dealing with electronic cinema camera. We have hundreds of choices. In real terms, there may be about 12 cinema cameras that the industry is sort of working within. So for us, we chose to focus on those. Having that data is wonderful. And we realized, you know, there's sufficient differences that which one are we going to pick? So a quick call around in Hollywood here to the major rental houses, we determined that the Arri Alexa was the dominant camera at the time. And we said, okay, so let's focus on that camera. We're going to try and optimize our light for the Alexa, and wherever it falls in relation to the other cameras, that's where it's going to be. Jump forward, now that we've got the ability to fully comprehend what the camera's seeing, now that we've developed this spectrometer, we now also have the ability to start working with two whites and an RGB element. With that RGB element now, we're able to actually track the Planckian curve. With that RGB element, we can now actually adjust for camera differences. So one of the things we're going to be introducing is the ability to look up a camera profile and input that into the light, meaning that depending on the camera that you choose to work with, we'll have a lookup table that will then optimize the performance of the unit, of the fixture, to optimize its performance to the camera. So this is a large leap forward, where previously you would rely on your subjective view of a monitor and say, you know what, on that skin tone, it couldn't, let me add a little bit of green, or let me add a little bit of magenta, whichever it could be. And again, within the technology, all that type of data could be saved and could be recalled, and so you could set up your fixture to optimize itself for a camera. But now with the lookup table, I think that really is the next step to do. But the challenge is that this is a foot race here, and things keep changing. So now our challenge is to stay relevant to the evolution of these cameras, which means we need an ongoing program to monitor these cameras. And I just pray to God that these camera companies will see the benefit of cooperating with manufacturers to say, here's the response curve, and as a software update, we can just keep everyone updated and on the mark. But that may be a pipe dream, I don't know. But hopefully the industry will evolve to that point where they'll be comfortable releasing that kind of data to at least manufacturers that know what to do with that data. So the whole thing about LEDs is that there's so many different ways of achieving what appears to be a common color point. And there are a lot of different ways to achieve white light. I mean, originally, red, green, blue gave you white light, but you couldn't photograph with that quality of light. Mixing two white sources gave you a white source, and that worked for the most part. Doing a single white and adding RGB allows you to track on the Planckian. It gives you a certain quality of white light. And there are multiple other ways of doing it, and some of them don't even touch on a white phosphor. They try to hit as many color points in the spectrum and blend it all together, and hopefully that'll work. The fact that there's so many different ways of doing it and so many different manufacturers are doing this, now when it comes to the set and you have a camera that has one distinct way of seeing color and you have multiple means of achieving color, now the challenge is, how is that camera going to see each one of those spectrums? And it actually sees them differently, and we were able to determine that through the program that we've developed, where we're trying to understand where this is going. So we feel that starting off with a full, broader white spectrum is key, and after that, just using a little bit of RGB to track the Planckian gets you where you want to be. As a byproduct of that RGB, you get all these colors. And then now the question is, okay, if I want to match the red color from this instrument to that instrument, how do we do that? Well, now you get into a whole game of color science, which means as an end user, we really have to start to understand what is gamut and where do these manufacturers take these varying elements to create this color space. Where are their color points? What gamut does it fall into? So Rec 709 is the most common gamut, but there are other gamuts way beyond that. Say if you're a theatrical lighting fixture manufacturer such as ETC, and you're trying to replicate all the colors of gels that lighting designers are used to, or you're going to have multiple color points and you're going to have a very broad gamut. Whether the camera can actually reproduce all of that is another story altogether. And here again, we're getting into this technology chase. So we start off with Rec 709, then we've gone to P3, P3+. We're talking about 2020. So gamut applies not just to what the camera can capture, it also applies to your display devices. So you can have a camera that is capable of recording certain colors, certain tones, that may be way beyond the gamut of your display device. This is one of the interesting things when you've shot some stuff on a camera that's got a broad gamut, you look at it Rec 709 and it looks good, but then suddenly you look at it on a monitor that can do 2020 and suddenly all the colors pop. And it's because now your saturation you can realize the saturation that the camera had captured, but was never reproducible back at 709. So, you toss out all these numbers, 709, 2020, P3, it all gets confusing, but it does bear some value to stop and just understand what, in fact, gamut is. Because once you understand gamut, then I think it'll also start enabling your understanding of how other fixtures might work together. Now, the ESTA organization has tried to come up with a recommended gamut that all manufacturers can put that as a feature on their lighting instruments, meaning that any values for colors will be referenced in an ESTA gamut. And so once manufacturers start harmonizing on a common gamut, there's a greater likelihood, no guarantee, but at least a greater likelihood that fixtures are going to start matching up. Where does that leave us, though, on the white light side? Color-wise, you might be able to mathematically remap something so that it looks the same on all instruments. Even that will be determined, though, by the choice of red, green, blue, or whatever other color points they've put in there. But when it comes to white light, you can have, by using a handheld color meter, you can match up Kelvin to the nth degree on an XY coordinate on the Planckian curve. Theoretically, you're now in the same, it's the same Kelvin. Mathematically you are, but the way the camera's going to see it is different because, again, white light, the way we produce it at Kino Flo is through a phosphor. It's a phosphor white, a tungsten source quality and a daylight quality. So it's a very broad spectrum. Now, using another methodology, that actual spectrum, when you see it on a spectral chart, the other spectrums may be narrower. And the minute they get narrower than the full spectrum, now you're losing spectral data that the camera is capable of capturing. But if it's not in the light source, the camera's not going to see it. And if the camera can't capture it, you can't create it later on. So this is where understanding what kind of white light is being generated is really critical. So if the goal is to have a good skin tone, it's all about the white spectrum. If the goal is to create a certain color, now it's about your RGB color space and what color points can you actually generate. But remember that if you have a full spectrum white source and you're illuminating subject, the camera is only recording reflected light. It's what's reflecting off the subject. So if you have a very saturated subject, a jar, a glass, or something that is maybe a very poppy green or something, as long as that full spectrum white is as broad a spectrum as possible, it'll pick up that reflected value and be able to reproduce it. It's another story saying, I want my light to generate that color point. That may be a different challenge because you may not have quite that gamut where that color point falls into. So again, it's this whole understanding of where you need to be with white light in order to achieve the skin tones you want, or am I going for a certain color point that I'm trying to generate. So these are things, as an end user, you start to make these decisions. I best sort of try to draw an analogy between Rembrandt and Vermeer. So we are the modern day visual artists. Those artists worked with a very defined, distinct group of pigments. And they knew what they had to combine in order to achieve the color quality they want. Today, our pigment is this instrument that's generating light. That pigment, that color, has to be capable of reproducing the colors we want to see. If you have a diminished white to begin with, or something that is not as broad spectrum as it potentially could, you're basically compromising the ability to reproduce certain colors. So this is where, as cinematographers, you really have to, if you're going to think like Vermeer and Rembrandt, you need to be conscious and aware of what that pigment is, what that light source is. Is it capable of reproducing these colors that I want? Now, even film was not fully capable of reproducing all the colors. There were certain tones that you just could not achieve on film. The same thing holds true with the cinema camera. So the hope is that in pre-production you have the ability to go ahead and shoot those things that you want to photograph and see how they reproduce, and then your best chance is to go with the fullest and broadest spectrum of white that you can get. One of the challenges that we have in today's industry is the fact that we've undergone this massive transformation from celluloid and silver halides to hard drives, zeros and ones. It's all electronic. You know, with silver halides and celluloid, here was a great archival medium. That negative, that was a lockdown. All the information you needed to reproduce that film was in that negative. What happens now in the electronic world? And as authors of the image, as cinematographers being authors of the image, how do you maintain that influence, that control over that image? So the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences has come up with a format called ACES. And ACES is a way of defining color space, and basically it's becoming a sort of a digital negative. So all the color information, all the timing information that you have for your current production, you can put it in a gamut, present gamut of whatever it is, and you can lock in that look, and that now becomes your digital source master. And later on, should that gamut or that capability expand, using what they call CTL, or color transform language, you'll be able to rewrite those color points and that data, transpose it into the new format. And so hopefully you'll carry forward the intent of the cinematographer, and that vision that they had, it'll be carried forward into the new format. And so the ACES gamut is so big, it encompasses the entire visible light field. It even goes off into negative space. It's just it's mathematics. What can I say? But this at least has the ability to carry that look on through. Now, the one thing that hasn't quite been solved is, how do you archive any of this data? Because we're on storage media that after 5 years starts to show data loss. Not only that, within 5 years, the actual reproduction of electronic images is evolving and changing. So what you need to do is reformat things onto the new technology. So the Academy put together a paper called The Digital Dilemma. You can look it up online. And I think they calculated something to the effect that it will cost well over $1 million over a 100-year period to try to preserve a film or a production, electronic production. So there may be some other means of avoiding this every 5 years having to transpose the data to a new format and a new medium. But this is part and parcel of the new industry. This is welcome to the electronic world.